They told me the retirement was permanent. I believed them, the way you believe things when you're tired enough and the paperwork has already gone through and your quarters on Veritas Station are half unpacked with boxes you haven't opened in 2 weeks. I was 58 years old. I had given 31 years to fleet intelligence, not to the fleet proper, not to the uniform and the rank structure and the career arc that the academy printed on a brochure and handed to 18-year-olds with ambitions, to the work behind the work, the analysis, the long reading of alien data architectures, the patient reconstruction of how other intelligences organized their world, the hours and months, and eventually years of building the kind of fluency that let you sit in a secure relay bay on some transit station and look at a sensor feed from 40 light years away and understand, not just observe, what you were seeing. My knees ached on cold decks. My eyes needed correction for fine print. I had watched 11 first contact events from the analysis side of that relay, reading probability trees and contact readiness indices, while other people stood on bridges and made the kind of history that got mentioned at ceremonies. I had written the documents those people used to understand what they were walking into. That had seemed sufficient for a long time. Then it had seemed like enough. Then I had filed the retirement papers and taken the posting on Veritas Station and begun the process of unpacking, slowly, boxes I was not sure I would ever fully open. 14 months later, I was standing in the observation alcove of the ISV Meridian Compact, watching the Soreth Continuances assessment probes complete their 6th day of cataloging passes across our convoy's transit corridor, and thinking that the retirement had lasted almost long enough to mean something. The recall had come from Director Halst personally. That meant it was either a serious problem or a serious honor, and in 31 years I had learned those two designations were almost always the same event at different distances. He had kept the message short. Halst was a man who measured his words the way an engineer measures load tolerances, not out of coldness, but out of respect for the weight of what he was carrying. The ISV Meridian Compact was leading humanity's first official diplomatic convoy into the Soreth Continuance's outer assessment corridor. The corridor was a 40 light-year band of space, the continuance maintained for the evaluation of new species, a kind of systematic waiting room, except that the waiting room had instruments in every wall, and the intelligence running those instruments had been doing this for 2 centuries without error. We had known the Soreth existed for 11 years. We had known they were watching us for 9. We had known, for the past 3, that they had moved humanity from their passive observation index to their active assessment queue, which was the closest thing to a formal invitation their methodology produced. The shift in classification was not a communication. The Soreth did not communicate before completing an assessment. They observed, they catalogued, they assigned, and then, if the classification warranted it, they opened a channel. The invitation was not a greeting. It was the process of evaluation beginning. No species in the Soreth's 200-year record had declined the invitation. No species had been declined either, not exactly. The continuance simply ran its assessment, assigned a contact classification, and either opened a channel or filed the species under a designation that translated, as nearly as our linguists and xenographers could render it, as asterisk not yet viable for sustained engagement. What not yet viable meant in practical terms was the subject of considerable academic debate and rather more urgent operational analysis in the intelligence community where I had spent my career. The Soreth had never, in 200 years, been wrong about a species. The ones they had assessed as militarily aggressive had remained so. The ones they had assessed as collaborative had collaborated. The ones they had assessed as asterisk not yet viable had, without exception across the entire historical record, collapsed or stagnated within 3 generations of the assessment. That was the weight of the thing, not their probe fleet, 60 ships running their cataloging passes across our corridor with the unhurried precision of a process that had been executed 340 times before and had never needed to be revised. The weight was the record, 200 years, species 341. Halst had wanted someone aboard who understood what the Soreth data architecture meant, who had spent a career reading alien analytical frameworks and could tell the captain if the assessment was drifting sideways before the continuance finished making its determination. I had written the fleet's primary assessment of the Soreth's contact methodology 7 years prior. It was still the document that people used. There were analysts half my age who had built their careers on the framework I had constructed from fragments and inference, and the occasional confirmed data point that the intelligence networks had managed to recover over the years. Halst had not needed to explain why he was calling me. He had simply told me the convoy departed in 4 days. I had told him I was retired. He had been quiet for a moment. Not impatient, not dismissive. Halst had too much experience with people who had earned the right to say no to be dismissive. Just quiet, in the way that a man is quiet when he has already run the calculation and is giving you the time to run it yourself. I asked if there was anyone else. He said there was no one with my specific background on the Soreth's analytical architecture, who was also cleared for the full assessment file, and available on the timeline the mission required. I asked how long the mission was. He said 3 weeks minimum, potentially 6, depending on how the assessment process developed. I thought about the boxes on Veritas Station, still half unpacked. I thought about the knees and the eyes and the 31 years, and the retirement that was supposed to be permanent. Then I thought about what it meant to be aboard the first official convoy into the Soreth's assessment corridor, as the intelligence officer who had spent 7 years building the only comprehensive framework humanity had for understanding what the continuance was looking for. I told Halst I would need 4 days to get my affairs in order, and a guarantee of civilian status aboard, no rank reactivation, no chain of command, observer access only. He said that was already the assignment as written. I reported to the Meridian Compact 2 days before departure. Captain Naravel received me with the precise professional courtesy of someone who had been told to expect a civilian observer, and had made her peace with the accommodation before I arrived. She was 44, Meridian-class certified for 11 years, 2 prior first contact adjacency missions as executive officer on different ships. She did not need me to explain what the Soreth continuance was. She had read the same documents I had written, or at least the portions cleared for operational distribution, and she had her own briefing team and her own analysis resources aboard. What she needed from me, what everyone on the compact needed from this mission, was a quiet 3 to 6 weeks in the corridor, a successful assessment, and a classification that let humanity proceed into whatever came next. The observation alcove they had cleared for me was small, a repurposed supply station off the secondary sensor bay, converted with a relay desk and a display panel, and a viewport that looked out along the starboard flank of the ship. It was enough. I did not need much. I had spent a career in small rooms with large amounts of information, and the alcove had both the data access and the sightline I needed to do the work I was there to do. The Soreth probes had arrived on day 2 of our corridor transit. Not dramatically. There was no intercept, no challenge, no transmission demanding identification. They simply appeared on the passive sensor grid, 60 distinct contacts spread across a 200,000 kilometer assessment envelope around our convoy, running their cataloging passes with the patient efficiency of a system that had been doing this for 2 centuries. Our own probes had tracked them from the moment they emerged. We had their drive signatures, their instrument profiles, their formation geometry. We did not query them. They did not query us. The assessment protocol was well established, at least from the observation records we had assembled. The continuance collected data for a period of roughly 14 to 21 days, then retired to process, then issued its classification. Our role, for the duration of the corridor transit, was to be available and observable, and to proceed on our transit heading without alteration. I watched the probe formation for hours at a stretch. That was my work, not the diplomatic preparation, not the communications protocols, not the crew readiness assessments that Captain Vell's team managed with their own clean efficiency. My work was to watch the instruments that were watching us, and to read them as carefully as I could, so that I would know before it became operationally significant if the assessment was developing in a direction that required attention. The Soreth were thorough. I had written that in the assessment document, and observing it directly, 6 days into the corridor, I found that thorough was still the right word but insufficient to carry the full weight of what the instruments recorded. They were not simply cataloging our ships. They were cataloging our ships the way a complete forensic accounting catalogs a balance sheet, not taking the summary figures at face value, but tracing every line to its origin. Hull geometry, drive signature profiles, electromagnetic output at multiple wavelengths, material composition readings from instruments that should not have had the resolution to work at 80,000 kilometers, thermal profiles of the crew through 3 separate hull layers, biological readings so specific that our own medical officer had noted, with the dry humor of a ship's doctor who had seen most things, that she was fairly certain the Soreth now had better baseline health data on the Compact's crew than she did. They were reading everything, not because they were hostile or suspicious. Their formation was never threatening. Their closest approach was well outside any tactically significant range, and their instrument profiles showed no weapons targeting emissions at any point across 6 days of observation. They were reading everything because that was what they did. Because 200 years of perfect classification had been built on reading everything, and the Soreth continuance did not become the kind of intelligence that was never wrong about a species by taking the summary figures at face value. I noted all of this. I noted the specific instruments they brought to bear on each element of our convoy. I noted the pattern of their cataloging passes, the sequence in which they moved through the data, the order of priority their instruments suggested. I was building a picture of what the Soreth considered significant, which was itself a form of intelligence about the Soreth. After 6 days, I had added 3 substantive appendices to the assessment document that would, eventually, be classified and filed, and used by the next analyst building on the framework I had built. On day 6, I noted that the probes were spending more time on the Compact than on the escort frigates. This was counterintuitive. The escort frigates were dark, running their standard transit configuration, minimal emissions, no active broadcasts, but they were warships in a way the Compact was not, and an intelligence assessing military capability would logically spend more time on the combat vessels than on the diplomatic cruiser at the front of the convoy. The Soreth were doing the opposite. The lead probe element had been running extended passes across the Compact's hull for 2 full days, at close enough range that our own sensors could track the specific wavelength patterns of their scanning instrument cycling through their sequences. I wrote a note in the assessment log. Soreth instrument priority appears to track hull record complexity rather than combat profile. Explanation unclear. Continue observation. On day 7, the probe formation changed. I noticed it during a late watch, my 3rd consecutive hour in the alcove without a break. The leading probe element, a 3-ship cluster that had been running the standard lateral cataloging pass across our starboard flank, stopped. Not a gradual deceleration. A full stop, relative to our transit vector, at 80,000 kilometers off our starboard side. The other elements of the probe formation redistributed their coverage arcs in a sequence I had not seen in 6 days of continuous observation. I had the sensor feed magnified before I had consciously decided to move, and was on the ship's internal channel 10 seconds after that. Captain Vell, the probe formation has restructured. Lead element is stationary, starboard 80,000 kilometers. I see it. Her voice was already alert. The bridge watch had caught the same change. Chief Ore, I need to know what the lead element is doing. Full passive read, don't query. Chief Petty Officer Sen Ore had been running the compact sensor station for the past 2 years. She had the kind of hands-on instrument fluency that showed up in the small efficiency of her work. The way she was already pulling the specific wavelength data before the captain finished asking. The way her assessment came out clean and sequential, rather than in the scattered fragments you got from people who were working faster than they could think. Lead element is stationary, instruments reconfigured. They've narrowed their scan envelope significantly. They were running a 200,000 kilometer broad sweep. Now they're focused on approximately 500 kilometers centered on our hull. A pause while she read the instrument returns. Captain, they're pulling registry data, not the header summary, the full maintenance archive. They're reading the repair logs. The bridge was quiet. Not alarmed, the crew had been prepared well, and quiet on a well-led ship means attention, not anxiety. Vel was at the forward station. I could see her from the alcove doorway, reading the same data Ore was pulling, her posture unchanged. I stood in the doorway and thought about the repair logs. The compact's maintenance archive was correct in every particular. It was accessible to any instrument that knew the query protocol. The hull transponder was a standard registry type, the same format used across fleet vessels for the past 20 years. The Soreth had been scanning our hull for 2 days. They had evidently determined the format and built a read capability, which was the kind of thing that should not have surprised me but did slightly anyway, in the way that watching a 200-year-old intelligence demonstrate a new capability always produces a small recalibration regardless of how thoroughly you think you've accounted for it. The repair logs contained the record of 17 incidents, hull breaches and armor impacts and structural repairs, and a sensor array that had been rebuilt twice, on a diplomatic cruiser, rated for non-combat diplomatic transit, with a crew complement configured for extended deep space operations and a medical bay equipped, appropriately for its mission profile, for long-term isolation incidents rather than mass casualty events. The Soreth's classification model was built on contact behavior. I had documented this extensively. They watched not just what a species was, but what a species chose to do specifically, how it separated its contact function from its military function, because the contact posture told them things about a species' organizational coherence and strategic stability that the military profile could not. A species that sent a diplomatic hull into an assessment corridor, because it genuinely distinguished between contact and combat, was a different category of contact prospect than one that sent a diplomatic hull as a fig leaf over a military approach. The distinction was not about the ships. It was about what the ships meant, what the designation signified about how the species organized its intentions. The compact was a diplomatic cruiser. Its designation was accurate. Its mission was diplomatic. It had a Class 4 armament, defensive and minimal. It had been built for corridor work, for the long-distance transit operations where ships needed to go and the situation was not always controlled. It had been built for exactly this kind of mission. And it carried the record of 17 incidents that it had not been built for. I understood, standing in the alcove doorway while the lead probe element read through the compact's maintenance archive, that this was the data point the Soreth had spent the past 2 days positioning themselves to find. Not because they had known what was in the logs, they could not have known, because they had been following the signal of the hull itself, the way an instrument follows an anomaly, tracing the reading toward its source. The hull had a complexity that the summary designation did not account for. They had been reading toward that complexity for 2 days. Now they had found what produced it. Captain, Ore's voice was steady. I have a query incoming. Soreth format addressed to our hull registry transponder directly, not our communications array. Vel turned toward the communication station. Let's hear it. The translation system processed it in real time. The hull registry queries were the format we had been most extensively briefed on. the Soreth Standard Data Request Protocol for assessment purposes. Query received. Soreth Continuance Assessment Element, Formal Data Request, addressed to ISV Meridian Compact Registry MC7 Taurus 119. Query: please explain the origin of 17 hull breach repair sequences logged on a vessel designated for non-combat diplomatic transit. Soreth Continuance requests explanation for discrepancy between vessel designation and vessel hull record. The bridge was very quiet. I watched Vel. She stood at the forward station, looking at the probe formation on the display, and I could see her thinking, not panicking, not calculating escape options, but genuinely thinking through what was being asked and what the honest answer was. In 31 years, I had watched a lot of officers face unexpected moments in first contact situations. The ones who reached for protocol first, for the rehearsed response, for the diplomatic language they had been briefed to deploy. Those were the ones who sometimes missed what was actually being asked. The ones who stopped and thought about the truth of the situation were the ones who handled the unexpected well. Vel was clearly one of the latter. "Mr. Aure," she said, "pull the repair logs. All 17 incidents, full detail, chronological sequence. Put them on the secondary display." "Already up, Captain." She moved to the secondary display and read the logs. The bridge held. Nobody filled the silence with commentary or questions or the nervous small talk that poorly disciplined crews produce when the stakes are high and the situation is uncertain. 4 minutes, roughly, while Vel read the complete record of her ship's 9 years of service. When she finished, she stood with her back to the bridge for a moment, and then she straightened. "Record a response. Their format used the registry query protocol they sent on." She paused once more, and then she began. ISV Meridian Compact to Soreth Continuance Assessment Element. Query acknowledged. The vessel designated ISV Meridian Compact sustained hull damage in 17 separate incidents over 9 years of service. The incidents are as follows. She read them out, all 17, one by one in order, without summary, without framing, without the diplomatic softening that would have been available to her and that she chose not to use. Each incident as the log had recorded it. The date, the location, the nature of the damage, the cause, the repair. The first, a debris strike during an escort mission through the Kell Passage, structural failure of an automated mining platform. 3 armor sections replaced, 1 bulkhead reinforced, no crew casualties. The second, the Soreth boundary, a disputed transit corridor, warning shots from a local authority that had escalated return fire to cover the survey convoy's withdrawal. 2 hull breaches, 1 crew member injured. The third, a micrometeor strike in open transit, minor, standard repair. The fourth, Tesev Station, 6 years ago, a diplomatic convoy arriving at a station mid-civil conflict without adequate intelligence preparation. 2 direct hits sustained while covering the evacuation of the station's civilian population. No return fire. Convoy and evacuees cleared before the ship disengaged. I knew the Tesev incident. I had been in the relay bay on Halcyon Station when the after-action report came through, 7 years into my career. I had read it twice and then sat with it for a while, the way you sit with a report that contains information you already knew in abstract and somehow had not fully understood until the specific details made it real. The compact had been 3 years in service then. It had absorbed 2 direct hits, its first combat damage, recorded on a hull that had never been intended for combat damage. Because the evacuation shuttles still had 12 minutes on their departure clock, and there was no other ship in the corridor with the armor to stay. Vel read through the 5th incident and the 6th and the 7th. Some were minor, single-event impacts, navigational hazards, the normal wear of operating in corridors where the situations were not always controlled. Some were not minor. The 10th incident, an escort rotation near the Vardeth boundary, where the convoy had been intercepted by a piracy operation using surplus military vessels. The Compact had been the heaviest armed ship in the formation, and the engagement had lasted long enough to leave the Compact's port armor in need of full replacement. The 13th, a transit corridor dispute where the Compact had served as the blocking element while the diplomatic team aboard negotiated a ceasefire, absorbing 3 hits in 40 minutes while the negotiation held. The 14th, a rescue operation in a collapsed transit system, debris impacts during a search pattern, the kind of damage that showed up in the logs as routine, but that represented hours of work in conditions no one had briefed the crew to expect. The 17th was the Care of Boundary. I had read the Care of After Action report when it came through. I had been in the process of writing the final sections of the Soreth assessment document at the time. The timing had produced one of those coincidences of perspective that you do not notice while it is happening and only understand later. The Compact had been assigned as primary escort for a supply convoy running through a contested transit sector. The intelligence preparation had assessed the risk as moderate. The assessment had been wrong, which was a failure I had been involved in peripherally enough to feel the edge of without being at its center. 8 ships, interdiction formation, already in place when the convoy dropped from transit. The Compact was not a warship. It was rated Class 4 armament, defensive configuration, crew complement of 340 with 11 positions in the weapons division. Its escort assignment had been a logistics decision based on availability and transit overlap, not a tactical deployment. It had been in the wrong place when the intelligence was wrong. It had stayed. The after-action report had used the phrase, sustained engagement beyond rated parameters *6 times. I had counted. The ship had positioned itself between the interdiction formation and the convoy, and it had held that position while the convoy's ships accelerated to transit departure velocity, which at the time had been 11 minutes away, and then 9, and then 7, and then 4. The Compact had absorbed 11 direct hits in those 11 minutes. It had lost its forward sensor array completely in the 3rd minute. It had lost port armor sections 7 through 19 in the 7th minute. It had lost 11 crew members across the engagement, 4 of them in the 7th minute strike, and it had not broken position. The convoy had cleared transit. Vel read the Care of incident exactly as the log recorded it. Date, location, engagement summary, damage to hull, crew killed in action. 11 names. The log listed them as fleet records required, and Vel read them because they were part of the record and the record was what was being asked about. Then she read the final line. Meridian Compact reached safe position following convoy transit confirmation. Entered emergency repair status. Returned to service following full structural assessment and repair at Halcyon Station. Rated fully operational. She stopped. End of incident record, she said. The vessel designated ISV Meridian Compact carries the record of its service. All repairs have been certified by Fleet Maintenance. The ship is fully operational and correctly designated for this mission. If the Soreth continuance requires additional documentation on any specific incident, we will provide it. A pause, brief, measured. ISV Meridian Compact out. Ore transmitted. The bridge held its stations. I went back into the alcove and sat down and thought about what had just happened, not the diplomacy of it, because I did not have enough information yet to analyze the diplomatic dimension, but the data architecture of it. What the Soreth had received, what their classification system was going to do with it. The continuance's methodology, as I had reconstructed it, was built on a core assumption about contact behavior that had held perfectly across 340 prior assessments. The assumption was this: species that sent diplomatic vessels into assessment corridors did so because they had made an operational distinction between their contact function and their military function. The diplomatic designation was a meaningful signal. It told the Soreth something real about how the species organized its intentions, about the coherence of its decision-making structure, about the stability of its categories, about whether the species was the kind of intelligence that could sustain a predictable relationship over time. In 340 prior assessments, the signal had been legible. The diplomatic hull carried a diplomatic record. The combat vessels were somewhere else, or running escort at a distance, or absent from the corridor entirely. The designation and the record agreed. The compact's designation and its record did not agree. Not because there had been an error, not because the diplomatic designation was a fiction covering a military reality. I had been in the intelligence community long enough to know the difference between a genuine diplomatic vessel and a fig leaf, and the compact was not a fig leaf. Its designation was accurate. Its mission was diplomatic. Every aspect of its configuration confirmed the designation. The record was also accurate. 17 incidents. 9 years of service in transit corridors where the situations had not always been controlled. A hull that had absorbed damage because it was present when presence was what the situation required, not because it had been designed or intended or specifically deployed for combat. The designation and the record were both true. They described the same ship. The ship had not become a warship. It had stayed a diplomatic cruiser for 9 years, and in that time it had also been in 17 engagements, and both of those facts existed simultaneously without contradiction, and the compact's maintenance archive made no attempt to reconcile them, because there was nothing to reconcile. I thought about the Soreth's classification model. I thought about 340 prior species, each of them fitted into the index, each assessment building out the model's predictive depth. I thought about what the model had never needed to account for because the signal had always been legible. Then I thought about what happened to a 200-year-old classification model when it encountered its first illegible data point. The probe fleet held its new formation for 11 hours and 43 minutes. I logged the time from Vel's transmission to the moment Ore's voice came over the ship channel, and I have the log still. I did not sleep. I sat in the alcove with the sensor feed on my display and watched the probe formation hold its position and thought about those 11 hours in every analytical framework I had. The lead probe element had moved closer during the wait, a slow, deliberate repositioning from its 80,000 kilometer station to approximately 55,000 kilometers off our starboard flank. Not aggressive, not a tactical maneuver. The instruments that had been reading the compact's registry were still active at the new position. They had not finished. They were still reading. I watched the instrument profiles cycle through their sequences on the passive sensor return. They were no longer reading only the maintenance archive. They had expanded their scan to the broader hull surface, the kind of deep structural read that an instrument does when it is building a complete physical history of an object rather than simply checking its data files. They were reading the hull itself, the seams where the armor sections had been replaced, the repaired sections where the breaches had been, the rebuilt forward sensor cluster, the marks that 9 years of service leaves in the metal of a ship regardless of how thoroughly the maintenance teams have worked, because a ship carries its history in the grain of what it is made of, in the places where the material had to give and was built back, in the subtle geometry of repairs that are correct but not original. I wrote in the assessment log, Soreth lead element is reading hull structure, not only registry data, correlating archive record against physical evidence. Hypothesis, they are confirming that the record and the object are consistent before processing the record's implications. Then I thought about that for a moment and added, the record and the object are consistent. Everything in the compact's maintenance archive is physically evident in the hull. The Soreth will find no discrepancy between the document and the ship. And then, consistency between record and object may itself be a data point. They are checking whether we hide things. We do not. The hull is exactly what the archive says it is. The escort frigates held their positions on the flanks, passive and patient. Their status reports came in on the convoy channel at the standard 2-hour interval. the clipped professional notation of officers maintaining their stations without the broader analytical context I had. They were good. They held. If it came to an engagement, they were ready, and the geometry of their positions made that readiness visible to any instrument that looked, which the Soreth's instruments certainly had. That readiness had been part of the convoy's design from the beginning. The compact at the front, the frigates dark on the flanks, the diplomatic vessel leading, and the combat capability running silent but present. A formation that said what it was without apology. The probe fleet had read that formation since day 2. They had catalogued the frigates as thoroughly as they had catalogued the compact, and it was the compact they had stopped to read more carefully. There was a logic to it that I kept turning over. The frigates were legible warships, rated and configured and presenting themselves as warships, no data point requiring extended analysis. The compact was the gap. The compact was claiming to be something that its record complicated. The frigates were exactly what they appeared to be. The compact was something else, a ship whose designation was accurate and whose record was also accurate, and the two accuracies did not produce a coherent picture by the standard of any index the Soreth had needed before today. I thought about what it meant to be an intelligence that had classified 340 species without error, and was currently spending 11 hours examining the one piece of data that did not fit. At 3:40 ship time, Ore's voice came through on the general channel. "Captain, incoming from the lead probe element. It's a full data packet, assessment format, and it's significantly longer than anything we've received from them before." Vel was on the bridge in 90 seconds. I was in the alcove doorway 2 minutes after that. The translation system processed the packet in stages, the progress indicator moving in small increments across the secondary display. The Soreth's communication architecture was dense, structured mathematical language, relational mappings that required the translation system to build context before it could render meaning, index values referencing concepts that our analysts had been working to define for 3 years. 18 minutes for the full processing run. I watched the indicator and did not fill the silence with speculation, which was the discipline that 31 years of intelligence work had drilled into me. You do not speculate usefully until you have the data. Everything else is noise. The translation populated. The packet opened with a formal acknowledgement of the registry query exchange, standard assessment protocol language, the kind of header that Soreth transmissions always carried, and that our analysts had decoded thoroughly. Then it continued. I read it carefully, then I read it again. The Soreth continuance had sent, as its first substantive direct communication to humanity, a document that began in standard assessment format and then, in a departure that our analysts would later describe as unprecedented in the continuance's 200-year transmission record, appended an explanatory context note. Not a classification, not a catalog entry, not a determination. An explanation addressed to the crew of the ISV Meridian Compact of why the assessment process had been suspended and what the suspension meant. Their model, as they described it in the dense relational language that our translation system rendered with approximate fidelity, had been constructed on a foundational assumption about contact designation behavior. In 340 prior assessments, the assumption had held without exception. Species that sent designated diplomatic vessels into assessment corridors did so because the designation represented a genuine operational distinction. The diplomatic hull carried diplomatic records. The record and the designation were congruent. The signal was legible, and the model was built on the legibility of that signal. Species 341 had transmitted a query response explaining the origin of 17 hull breach repair sequences on a vessel designated for non-combat diplomatic transit. The explanation had been received and processed. The explanation was factually consistent with the hull record and with all observable evidence regarding the vessel and its operational history. The explanation contained no detectable deception indicators by any of the continuance's analytical instruments. The explanation was also not categorizable. The continuance's index had classification entries for the following contact designation behaviors: a species sending a genuine diplomatic vessel with a genuinely diplomatic record, a species sending a nominal diplomatic vessel concealing a military reality, a species sending a mixed formation in which the diplomatic element was protected by visible military elements, a species sending a diplomatic vessel as a deterrent signal, the combat profile visible but the diplomatic designation maintained as a face-saving frame. The continuance had no index entry for a species whose diplomatic hull had accumulated a combat record through repeated election to place itself between hazard and ships. It was escorting, over 9 years of service, without the designation changing, and without the record being concealed, and without the ship being converted to a combat classification at any point during or after the incidents. The continuance did not have a category for this. The document then did something that, and I have read this section many times in the years since, in the original translation and in subsequent improved renderings, represented something genuinely new in what we knew of the Soreth's communication methodology. They asked questions, not demanded explanations. Asked. The phrasing, as our analysts later worked to refine it, carried the unmistakable register of genuine inquiry, of an intelligence that had encountered something it did not understand and was choosing to investigate rather than categorize by approximation. They had found the 11 names in the care of Boundary Record. They had parsed that the names corresponded to crew members who had been aboard the vessel when it elected to remain in an engagement beyond its rated parameters. They had processed the tactical record of the engagement and determined that the election to remain was not a command error or a navigational constraint. The vessel had had clear departure vectors available throughout the engagement. The election had been made. The vessel had stayed. 11 people had not come back. The Soreth wanted to understand what drove the election, not the tactical outcome which their instruments had modeled with their customary precision, the motivational substrate, the decision architecture, the mechanism by which an intelligence that had designated a vessel for non-combat diplomatic transit could also, with the same designation intact and the same operational parameters in place, elect to use that vessel as a blocking element in an 11-minute engagement against an 8-ship interdiction force. They said in the precise hedged language of an intelligence that never stated as fact what it had not verified, but that also did not hedge what it had verified, that they had reviewed their records of all 340 prior species assessments and found no comparable data point. They said the absence of comparable data was itself significant. They said that the standard classification process had been suspended pending resolution of the classification gap, and that they were formally requesting dialogue to support the resolution process. In 200 years, the Soreth continuance had never formally requested dialogue before completing a classification. Vel read the full translation from the secondary display. I watched her face and saw the same careful stillness I had seen when the query first arrived, but different now, the quality of it altered by what was in the document. She looked at the text for a long time. Then she turned toward the communication station. Direct reply channel, their query protocol. Ready, Captain. She took one breath. Soreth continuance, ISV Meridian Compact. We have received your transmission and we have read your questions. I'll answer them as clearly as I can. The record you found is the record of this ship's service. The Meridian Compact was built for deep transit corridor operations, for the long routes between systems where the work is necessary and the conditions are not always predictable. Over 9 years, we have operated in those corridors. The damage in the maintenance archive was incurred in the course of that operation. Sometimes the cause was navigational, equipment failure debris. the ordinary hazards of moving through space that is not clean. Sometimes it was hostile action by parties who were not interested in the distinction between a diplomatic vessel and any other kind. In every case, the question was the same question. What is this ship for? The answer has always been the same answer. This ship is for getting the mission through. The mission has been different things in different incidents. A survey convoy that needed to reach its destination. A station evacuation where the shuttles needed 12 minutes they did not have. A supply convoy that needed a corridor when the corridor was blocked. The mission is whatever is behind us that needs to get through. The ship's purpose is to make sure it gets through. The 11 crew members at the care of Boundary were professionals who understood the situation they were in. The ship stayed in the engagement because the convoy needed 11 more minutes and we were the ship in position to give them those minutes. That is not a complicated decision architecture. It is a very simple one. You are the ship that is there. You are the ship that can hold the position. You hold the position. If the cost of holding the position is the hull, you pay it. If the cost is more than the hull, you pay that too, because the ships behind you are why you are there. I don't know how your classification system works at the level of detail your transmission describes. I know it has worked very well for a very long time. What I can tell you is that the record you found is not an anomaly in our data. It is the data. We send the ships we have into the situations that exist. The Meridian Compact has a diplomatic designation because its mission is diplomatic. It has a combat record because 9 years of service in transit corridors produced combat. We don't consider those facts to be in contradiction. We consider them to be the record of the same ship doing its job in the conditions it encountered. If that is what has created a classification gap in your assessment process, I am prepared to spend as much time as you require explaining it. That is what this mission is for. That is what I am here for. A pause. ISV Meridian Compact out. Aura transmitted. I went back into the alcove. I sat down. I thought about what I had just watched and heard, and I turned it over in the frameworks I had spent 3 decades building, and I tried to understand what it meant. The bridge crew went about their work. The escort frigates held their dark-running positions 40,000 kilometers off the flanks, passive and patient, their crews presumably doing the same thing the Compact's crew was doing, monitoring the sensor feeds, maintaining their stations, waiting. The convoy's transit heading held steady. The probe formation held its restructured positions. The lead element at 55,000 kilometers, instruments active. The broader fleet at their distributed assessment positions, all of them waiting, in their own way, for the same thing. I spent part of the wait reviewing my notes from 6 days of probe formation observation. I was looking for anything I had seen in the formation's behavior that, in retrospect, indicated the Soreth had been tracking toward this data point for longer than I had realized. The 2-day concentration on the Compact's hull. The progressive narrowing of the lead element scan envelope. In retrospect, yes, there was a clear progression in the data, the kind of purposeful narrowing that I had noted in my logs as instrument priority tracking, and that I now understood as something more specific. They had been following the signal of the hull for 2 days. The hull read as complex in ways the designation did not predict. They had been reading toward the source of that complexity. The move to the maintenance archive was not a sudden decision. It was the conclusion of a 2-day process of instruments following the anomaly to its root. That was, I thought, both reassuring and worth noting carefully. The Soreth did not make sudden moves. When they changed their behavior, the change had been building in the data for longer than the moment of change suggested. That was a useful thing to know about an intelligence you were going to be in dialogue with for 14 days. They were patient. They were methodical. When they asked a question, they had already been working toward the question for some time. I wrote that in the assessment log. The Soreth continuance had spent 200 years building a classification model that had never been wrong. They had built it through the most rigorous data collection process any intelligence in the known galaxy had ever constructed, 340 species catalogued, each one assigned to its place. The model refined and extended with each assessment until it had become not just a catalog but a genuine predictive system. A machine that could look at a new species and determine, before the first formal interaction, what kind of intelligence it was dealing with and what kind of relationship was possible. They had suspended that process, not because we had outmaneuvered them or demonstrated a capability that exceeded their threat models or made ourselves too dangerous to categorize. Because the diplomatic cruiser at the front of our convoy had a maintenance log that did not fit the index. A hull that had been in 17 engagements because it had been present when presence was required. A designation that had never changed because the designation was accurate. The ship was for diplomatic transit, and diplomatic transit was what it did. And the engagements had been part of the work not because the work was combat, but because the corridors where the work happened were not always safe. 11 names in a registry record, filed correctly because the fleet required accurate records, and because the names were real people and real people belonged in the record. No presentation, no stage management, no decision to show the Soreth something in particular. The record was what it was because the work had been what it was, and the compact had brought all of it into the corridor the same way it had always carried its record. Openly, because the record was accurate and there was no reason to do otherwise. The response came in 41 minutes. Short, clean. The precise concision of an intelligence that, when it had understood something, stated it without elaboration. We have processed your response. The concept of a vessel's designation and its accumulated service record existing simultaneously, without contradiction, is not currently representable in our classification index. We are initiating the construction of a new index entry. The process requires consultation across the continuance. We estimate 14 standard days for completion. We are extending the corridor transit authorization for the ISV Meridian Compact and its convoy for a period of 30 days. We request that the vessel remain available for continued dialogue during the classification process. We have not initiated this process before. The bridge was quiet for several seconds after Ore read it aloud. Vel looked over her shoulder at the alcove. Corin, what does that last line mean? I had been turning it over since the words had come through. It means what it says, I told her. The Soreth don't add information to a transmission that isn't relevant to the transmission's purpose. If they included the statement that they haven't done this before, it's because they judged that information to be necessary context for us to understand the transmission correctly. I looked at the probe formation on the sensor feed, the lead element still at 55,000 kilometers, still running its instruments, now reading something different from what it had been reading 12 hours ago. They're telling us this is different. They're choosing to tell us. That's more than a status update. That's a form of transparency from an intelligence that has operated on strict information protocols for 200 years. You think the classification will be favorable, she said, not quite a question. I thought about what I had read in the transmission, about a 200-year-old model encountering its first gap and responding by building a new category rather than forcing the data into the closest available fit. About an intelligence that had never deviated from its assessment process in 2 centuries, choosing to stop, to ask, to wait for an answer before proceeding. I think, I said carefully, that the classification may not be the most important outcome of this mission. I think the way they are conducting this assessment is already telling us something significant about the kind of intelligence we are dealing with. I paused, working through it. They found a gap in their model and they didn't paper over it. They didn't classify us under the nearest available category and file the anomaly as a rounding error. They stopped. They asked. They are now building a new index entry, which means they are changing their model to account for what they found. A system that has been accurate for 200 years is accurate partly because it has the capacity to do that, to find a gap and fill it honestly rather than pretend the gap doesn't exist. I looked at the sensor feed for a moment. That's the best thing that could have happened here. That's the thing you want to find in an intelligence you're going to be in a relationship with across 40 light years. Vel considered that. Then she nodded once, the small decisive movement of someone who has run the calculation and arrived at a conclusion she can work with. Draft a response for the dialogue framework. 14 days. I want something ready within 2 hours. Yes, Captain. I went back to the alcove desk and opened a blank document. I sat with it for a while before I wrote anything. Outside the viewport, the corridor was dark and still. The probe formation's contacts steady on the sensor returns, the lead element holding its position 55,000 kilometers off the starboard flank. Patient, still reading. I had spent 7 years writing about the Soreth. I had read every data fragment the intelligence networks had recovered on the continuance's methodology, every sensor record from assessments we had observed from outside, every theoretical framework that our analysts had produced on machine intelligence contact dynamics. I had written the document that Fleet Intelligence used as its primary reference. I had thought, in the way that you think you understand something when you have spent years building a comprehensive analytical framework for it, that I understood what the Soreth were. I had understood what they did, their methodology, their instruments, their classification system, the depth of their data collection. I had documented all of it with as much precision as the available evidence permitted. What I had not understood, what I had not had the evidence to understand, and what the past 12 hours had given me was the thing underneath the methodology, the disposition that produced it. The Soreth had spent 200 years classifying species correctly because they were the kind of intelligence that stopped when they found something they did not know, not when the data was threatening or challenging or contrary to their existing model, when it was simply new, when it did not fit the existing categories, when the honest response was to acknowledge the gap and build something new to account for it rather than force the data into the closest available shape. That was not a small thing. I had spent 31 years in intelligence, and the most consistent source of error I had observed, not in the intelligence community specifically, but in every analytical context I had worked in, was the gap between what a model predicted and what the evidence showed, papered over by analysts who trusted the model more than the data. The Soreth's 200-year record of perfect classification was not evidence that their model was perfect. It was evidence that their model was capable of updating when the evidence required it. And the evidence had required it. The Compact's maintenance archive had produced a data point that did not fit the index, and the continuance had stopped their process, asked their question, received an answer, and was now building a new category. Not reluctantly, not under pressure, because the gap existed and the honest response to a gap was to fill it. I thought about what it meant to be species 341 in a database maintained by an intelligence like that. The dialogue framework I drafted covered 14 days of structured question and answer, beginning with the Soreth-specific questions about the Compact's decision architecture and expanding into the broader operational context, the nature of convoy escort work, the institutional history that had produced the Compact's service record, the fleet's own classification structures for vessel designation and mission type. I tried to give them the complete picture, not the presented picture. Because the distinction was the thing they had already demonstrated they could detect, and because the complete picture was the one that had produced the gap in their index, and the gap in their index was the thing that had made them stop and ask. I sent the draft to Captain Vel at 5:40. At 600 I was still in the alcove when the morning watch came on. I had been there for close to 6 hours without a break. My knees ached, the way they ached on cold decks after a long time in one position, and my eyes were tired from the display light. I was 58 years old and 14 months out of a retirement that had been supposed to be permanent. I did not feel tired. Outside the viewport, the lead probe element was still at 55,000 kilometers, still running its instruments, still reading, patient and attentive and working, The way something works when it has found a gap it is genuinely interested in filling. I thought about the 14 days ahead. The questions the Soreth had asked, which were questions about what kind of decision framework produced a hull like the compacts. I thought about the answer Vel had given them, simple, plain, without apology. And I thought about what it would mean to spend 14 days explaining that answer in full. To take an intelligence that had classified 340 species and give it the complete context of the one species that had produced a gap in its index. I thought about the new category they were building. We had a great many hulls like the compacts, a great many ships that carried records their designations did not predict, a great many 11-minute engagements in the logs of vessels that had been built for other purposes and had done what the situation required when the situation required it. The fleet was full of that. The histories were full of it. It was not a policy or a program. It was a habit, accumulated over decades of operating in corridors where the work was necessary, and the conditions were not always controlled. I had not thought to call it anything in particular. It was just how the work got done. You were the ship that was there. You held the position until the ships behind you were through. The Soreth were building a category for it. I hoped it would be large enough to hold what it was describing. I thought it would have to be. The retirement was waiting on Verida's station. The boxes were still half unpacked, but the morning watch was on and the dialogue framework was drafted and the 14 days were beginning. And outside the viewport the lead probe element was still there, still reading, patient and attentive and curious. The way an intelligence is curious when it has found something new and chosen to understand it rather than dismiss it. I decided the retirement could wait a little longer. Some work you stay for, some ships earn that.